It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Harbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. So, we have come to the conclusion of this month's Second Doctor Cyberpalooza with the Doctor Who serial The Invasion from 1968. In fact, this was the final full serial to conclude and be shown in its entirety in 1968. The Invasion is the only serial that was ever 8 parts long. Not before and not since had there been one of that length. The Invasion served as the third serial of Season 6, which also proved to be Patrick Troughton's final season. I'm going to come back around to that in a bit, but as we saw in The Wheel in Space, Season 5 concluded with Jamie and the Doctor being joined by Zoe Harriet. Now, interestingly, we saw her having to make the choice on whether or not she wanted to join them after seeing some footage of a Dalek murdering a guy in cold blood. Now, we never actually saw her face down the Daleks, but she faced the Cybermen twice, and Jamie faced them down 4 times himself. Now, that happens to be more than anybody else, but we'll wrap all of that up before the end of this episode. But let's talk about the biggest thing that would start with this serial, Unit. The previous season's serial, The Web of Fear, introduced Colonel Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart, played by Nicholas Courtney. Now, the Colonel was a member of the Scots Guard sent to investigate some business with the Yeti and the Great Intelligence. Those will be stories for another time. However, Courtney was an Egyptian-born British actor. He got into acting on TV in an episode of The Avengers before being considered for a role in a 1965 serial in the first Doctor's era, The Crusade. That was directed by Douglas Camfield. That role was for Richard the Lionheart that would ultimately be played by Julian Glover, who would, about 16 years after that, play a Bond villain in the underrated For Your Eyes Only. However, Camfield came back around to Courtney and cast him as Space Security Agent Brett Vion in the first Doctor epic 12-part serial, The Daleks' Master Plan. Camfield again cast him for The Web of Fear, but as a different character, and it was when David Langton gave up the role of Colonel Lethbridge Stewart that Camfield moved Courtney over to that role that he would forever be linked to. After that whole thing with the Great Intelligence and the Yeti, UNIT would be created. UNIT was the acronym for the United Nations Intelligence Task Force. However, after the classic era came to a close, the real United Nations didn't want to be connected to the fictional organization, so it had to be changed to Unified Intelligence Task Force. I don't know, sounds like to me that the UN didn't like anyone thinking that they really did have a whole military organization dealing with space threats. Where are you at, my conspiracy theorist buddies? But anyway, Lethbridge Stewart would eventually be promoted to Brigadier, and we see him in this serial in his new role dealing with the Cybermen invasion. Of course, after the Second Doctor becomes the Third Doctor, the Brigadier, as he's most commonly referred to, becomes a main cast member and is, in total, over the next many years, seen in over about 100 individual episodes. The serial begins with the TARDIS becoming trapped hovering over the dark side of the moon. Now, the Doctor is confused because it's rematerialized, but it's not moving toward or away from Earth. The Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe are soon startled by a missile being fired from the surface of the moon. The TARDIS is barely able to escape before the explosion, and they land on Earth where the TARDIS is damaged and the Doctor opts to use a cloaking device to hide the ship and then find someone who might be able to help them with repairs. And this ties back to earlier serials dealing with the Great Intelligence and an ally of the Doctor and Jamie's named Professor Edward Travers. Interesting note, Travers is played by Jack Watling, father of the actress from the previous seasons Deborah Watling, who played the companion Victoria. We talked about her in the Tomb of the Cybermen episode. But anyway, the Doctor and his companions are picked up by a guy who questions how the trio could have gotten into the compound of a shadowy electronics company called International Electromatics. After the truck driver helps the TARDIS crew get outside the compound's gates, two black uniformed men with guns demand the driver return to the compound, and when the driver doesn't comply, he gets shot dead. The Doctor eventually makes it to London and the home of Professor Travers, who's recently gone missing after leasing his house to a Professor Watkins and his niece Isabel. However, Professor Watkins is also unreachable, and he also works for the shady International Electromatics company just like Travers did. Now, unable to get anywhere with the automated telephone system at the electronics company, the Doctor and Jamie decide to go straight to IE offices. The Doctor is incensed by the whole place seemingly working directly from automation, including the automated receptionist. So the Doctor decides to explore on his own. It's kind of funny how the Doctor is like very anti-computer and anti-mechanism in this serial. It's very bizarre. But outside, two men are watching for the Doctor and Jamie to come out, and inside, the pair are captured by the seeming head of the company, the menacing Tobias Vaughn. The men outside, one of which is Corporal Benton of Unit, which we will be much better acquainted with later on in the Third Doctor era, but he learns from HQ that they are to retrieve the Doctor and his friend. Once escorted outside, the Doctor makes note that Tobias Vaughn is quite peculiar. He doesn't seem to blink very often, at least not as often as a regular human should. Sure enough, Vaughn opens a panel in his office wall and seemingly reports to silently to a large out-of-this-world machine. Now, after leaving the IE office, the Doctor and Jamie are cornered by members of Unit, and they are taken to Unit HQ, where Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart meets with the Doctor and Jamie in a happy reunion. The Brigadier is still a little suspect of the Doctor's insistence that he travels throughout space and time and such, but he still trusts the man, and he updates the Doctor on what's happened in the last 4 years since they last saw each other. And what's more, the Brigadier has been keeping an eye on the IE buildings, one in England, or one in southeast England, one in London, because there are people who go inside and don't come out. And if they do go in and come out, they come out a little bit different. However, the Brigadier can't move on a guy as connected as Vaughn is, so he wants the Doctor and his friends to deal with getting the good info he needs in order to bring him down. Speaking of, Isabel and Zoe, who stayed behind earlier, are now looking for their friends at the IE building. Vaughn has learned from his extraterrestrial partners that the Doctor is considered a hostile threat. Vaughn, though, has Zoe and Isabel brought to him and basically uses them as bait to lure the Doctor. Now, this serves to have Vaughn bring the Doctor and Jamie to the countryside factory for IE, where the pair believe they will find Zoe and Isabel, who've been stashed away in a shipping crate. Now, Jamie grows more and more frustrated that they aren't really doing anything to save Zoe. That's kind of a typical character trait of his. The Doctor is becoming a little more curious about who this Vaughn character is and why he's granting them so much access. And this access is actually for the Doctor and Professor Watkins to have a conversation and to reveal some of the secrets about the Doctor and the ship that Vaughn's allies, quote unquote, are fearful of. Now, naturally, the Doctor and Jamie are able to escape the guards, but they aren't able to get too far away for the moment. Meanwhile, we learn that Vaughn plans to use the Doctor's great ship to escape the eventual takeover of their mysterious allies. Once they take over, Vaughn says he and his men will no longer be human, so he's got to find the Doctor, figure out what this spaceship of his is, and how to use it before the invasion begins. The Doctor and Jamie save the captured Zoe and Isabel and are able to make a getaway thanks to UNIT. Vaughn makes a call to the Ministry of Defense, who is ordered to shut down UNIT so that they don't continue to interfere. And the Doctor ruminates on the missile that was fired at the TARDIS before they landed on Earth. It just so happens there have been reports of UFOs whose signals all get basically lost over southeast England. And as it happens, that's where IE's Countryside compound is. So the Doctor investigates further and discovers the hidden allies of Vaughn's are, of course, the Cybermen. So here's what Vaughn's up to. Professor Watkins is building a machine called the Cerebration Mentor that is meant to be a teaching machine and is of vital importance to Vaughn, using Vaughn's expansive electronics network and various radio devices sold all across the world. The Cybermen will send out a hypnotic signal to incapacitate the world's population and minimize resistance by way of satellites that are orbiting Earth. Once the Cybermen overrun Earth, and with the humans easily able to be rounded up, the Cybermen will collect them and send them for cyber conversion. So, with the chess pieces in place, the Brigadier is stymied by the Minister of Defense, who is under the control of the Cybermen and needs proof of an invasion in order to override the minister's orders to stand down. Isabel decides that, well, she'll go to London and find the Cybermen in the sewer tunnels awaiting their orders to begin the invasion and take a picture, which should provide the proof UNIT needs to take action. Meanwhile, the Doctor realizes that the radio transmitters that are the best sellers of international electromatics are the key to the invasion. He has one thanks to Vaughn giving the radio to Jamie when the Doctor and Jamie first met him. Isabel, Jamie, and Zoe get into the sewer tunnels and get trapped by the Cybermen, but the good news is that UNIT was close behind them the whole time. Now, sure enough, the Cybermen begin their invasion, and it starts with the Cybermen boosting their hypnotic signal to pacify the human race. The Doctor and UNIT were barely able to produce enough nullifying devices to protect themselves and mount a resistance. Now, the Brigadier has a member of his team work with the Russians to figure out a way to launch a warhead onto one of their space rockets to basically blow up the Cybermen ship. While the Doctor confronts Vaughn to try to talk sense into him about how the Cybermen will not honor their agreements, Zoe helps the Brigadier and the British Army compute and predict the movements of the Cybermen fleet and destroy all their ships. When she succeeds and the army gets rid of the fleet, the Cybermen believe that Vaughn betrayed them, and they decide that they're going to wipe out all life on Earth. Now, the Cybermen basically are opting to deploy a weapon of mass destruction that they call the Cyber Megatron Bomb. Because Vaughn is so upset about the Cybermen going against him now, he decides to help the Doctor find the homing signal to prevent the bomb from being delivered on its target. But the Cybermen, realizing that they can still deliver the bomb, they just have to move a little closer to Earth, and they do so and prepare to drop the weapon. However, the Cyber Megatron bomb is ultimately destroyed by an anti-missile rocket. The Russian space rocket then destroys the cyber ship that is broadcasting the hypnotic signal, freeing humanity and effectively ending the Cybermen invasion. Alright, so let's get to my 3 favorite things about the invasion. First, this is paced much more closer to a James Bond movie than a Doctor Who serial. Between the sneaking around by the Doctor and Jamie at International Electromatics and UNIT being involved, it's got a much more of an action-adventure slant to it. Yeah, there's a little bit of intrigue, but what's the most peculiar thing about the story is that it's really a big chess game. the Doctor and Brigadier basically know that Vaughn is up to no good. Vaughn knows that Unit is watching him, and he learns from his Cybermen friends that the Doctor is a problem. However, Vaughn plays it cool. Unit is stuck because the Brigadier can't justify moving against him. So, apparently, aside from having extraterrestrial assistance, Vaughn, from the very beginning, has the upper hand, and he knows it, and he consistently plays it. That makes him a little bit more of the typical Bond villain who will practically tell the hero right to his face what his plan is, and there's not much the hero can do about it for a considerable amount of time. And really, honestly, that builds some pretty good tension for the story. Next, let's talk about the restraint of the serial. It's not until the final moment of the fourth episode, the fourth part of this 8-part serial, that we see as Cyberman. Again, the Cybermen are redesigned with bulkier, more robotic headpieces that really do resemble much more of what you think about as far as a Cyberman from the classic era. However, I personally think this is the best of the Cybermen stories up to this point. In fact, it might be the best Cybermen story of them all, at least from the classic years. The first half of the story deals with a much more insidious human villain, but then it switches to a more action-packed military resistance to the Cyberman invasion. And plus, perhaps one of the best and most iconic moments in all of Doctor Who history is the shot of the Cybermen beginning to emerge from the sewers of London, and we see them marching down the steps by St. Paul Cathedral. In fact, it's a shot repeated in a later Cyberman 2-part story for New Who in 2014. One more thing about the Cybermen is that's kind of fascinating in this serial is the idea of this crazed Cyberman that runs wild in the sewers for a little bit. This thing is created by Vaughn testing out the cerebration mentor device of Watkins' design and pours fear into the Cyberman's brain. It drives the guy crazy. This is the first time the Cybermen were ever shown to have any kind of concept of emotion. Now, granted, the Doctor says something to the effect of that it introduced that unknown quality to the Cybermen and overloaded that particular Cyberman's circuits. But I see it as it kind of reawakens the emotion of that Cyberman. That it basically kind of manipulates a leftover part of their former humanity. Now, this will come up a few times after this serial, and it's actually been used a couple of times in New Who with some pretty kind of gut-punching results. There's one point in David Tennant's era where he incapacitates a newly converted Cyberman, and it finds out that it was a woman who was either getting ready to marry her fiance or was on her honeymoon when she was taken and converted into a Cyberman. And it's sad because, well, she's dead, and she's having these flickers of memories that are kind of surfacing once the Doctor was able to kind of reestablish the emotional part of the Cyberman's brain. So it was kind of cruel of the Doctor to really kind of do that, but I guess it saved his life. So I don't know. Anyway, it's something that's been, it's something that's been played with, and the concept began with episode 5 of The Invasion. And lastly, The Invasion is loaded with some really good performances. Patrick Troughton is at his absolute best of the 4 serials that we've discussed this month. I would say second place would be The Tomb of the Cybermen, but we're actually seeing him deal with this kind of chess match against Tobias Vaughn, and it's great. Wendy Padbury and Fraser Hines both seem like they've been together for years now. Their interaction with the Doctor also feels very natural, which had been easy for Hines for a while since he was with Patrick Troughton for so long in his run. But Padbury has fully come into the fold of the series and of this team, basically. Of course, I will always have a deep admiration for Nicholas Courtney as the Brigadier. Seeing him here working closely with the Doctor to defend Earth from an invasion really makes me think of my favorite era, which is the era of the Third Doctor that would be starting in just another year from this serial basically premiering, or finishing up, I should say. However, the real star of this serial is Kevin Stoney as Tobias Vaughn. He's brilliant as the calm and cool as a cucumber main heavy in this. He could have very easily overacted this role, but he doesn't. Alone, he is likely able to do a lot of damage as a true villain. He ends up having a considerable amount of scenes where you might not be all that sure that the Doctor will get away scratch-free and not at least roughed up in some sort of way. But as good as everybody is in this, there are actually two members of the cast, both of which playing the Watkins characters, who are kind of random yet key actors for me. Professor Watkins is played by Edward Burnham, who would come back in 6 years' time to play Professor Kettlewell in Tom Baker's first serial Robot. He's a very memorable character actor. He looks like a professor. He looks like almost like an absent-minded professor of sorts. It's great. But Isabel is played by Sally Faulkner. Now, Faulkner would appear in 1974's Vampires, which is a bit of a sultry horror flick with two women who lure people into a trap, basically so that they can feed upon them. However, I actually know her best from the incredibly interesting movie Prey, which is also known as Alien Prey, from the later 70s. In that, she plays one of two lesbians living in the British countryside who meet a man who turns out to be an alien who's come to feed on the local life. It's a peculiar movie, and she's really good in it as the dominating woman of the two lesbians. And it's kind of interesting because it's like there's terror coming from outside the house and there's kind of terror inside the house with how she kind of treats the younger woman in the couple. It's an interesting movie with interesting characters in it, and it's just one of those movies that you see and it just kind of sticks with you, and you end up seeing it a few more times. I've covered it on my website, B Movie Enema. So it's interesting to seeing her in this character as this kind of fashion model / fashion photographer character who's completely different than the character I've seen her in Prey. But it's fascinating, and but she's an incredibly likable character in this, even if she starts off kind of aloof, if you will. But before we finish things up, we just spent an entire month with the Second Doctor, his various companions, and of course the Cybermen. The invasion was close to the end of one era and a definitive end to another for quite some time. It's been said that Patrick Troughton once gave the advice to Fifth Doctor actor Peter Davison upon Davison taking over for Tom Baker that he should not remain in the role for more than 3 years. Troughton, from what I understand, anecdotally, felt that 3 years was the perfect amount of time to tell all the stories that Doctor needed, and for that actor to have a steady role before heading off into other ventures. Some of that is due to concern over typecasting and so forth. But of course, Jon Pertwee would go for 5 whole seasons, though it's also rumored that he would have gone longer if not for the tragic death of his friend Roger Delgado. Also, interestingly, even though John Pertwee went for 5 seasons and Patrick Troughton only went for 2 full seasons and completed the 4th season of the series for William Hartnell, both Pertwee and Troughton appeared in the same number of individual parts. But anyway, Tom Baker would command the role for 7 seasons in all, and I think he appeared in over 150 individual episodes. But Troughton followed his own advice, and at the end of this season, season 6, Troughton decided to step away from the role. And at the end of the 6th season, the Second Doctor, Jamie and Zoe, would get mixed up in some business with an offshoot of the Doctor's race of people, and they were called the Warlords. When the Doctor simply couldn't defeat this group of baddies on his own, he is forced to call in the Time Lords to kind of clean up the mess. However, when he's unable to get away from where he was and where he called the Time Lords to in order to escape in time, he's captured by the Time Lords and put on trial for interfering with the universe's natural progression of events. He's ultimately found guilty and given 2 primary punishments. First, a forced regeneration into the Third Doctor, and second, exile to Earth without any way to leave until the Time Lords feel that he's paid his penance. But what about Jamie and Zoe? Well, the Doctor's not sent to Earth with these 2 time-displaced humans. No. They are returned to their proper place and time, basically at the moment in which they would have left with the Doctor. But in kind of a dick move, the Time Lords erase their memories of their time spent traveling with the Doctor. We see Zoe return to the wheel after the Doctor defeated the Cybermen, and Jamie is put back into his 19th century Scottish Highlands, where he sees a redcoat and bravely charges him with a sword. Wendy Padbury and Fraser Hines would reappear as images of Zoe and Jamie in the 20th anniversary special, The 5 Doctors, as tricks of the mind. How the Second Doctor knows of their fates? Well, there's actually a reason of that. He comments that, that Zoe and Jamie were taken back to their time with their memories erased of them. So how does he know that if he too was basically forced into becoming the Third Doctor? Well, there's been a long-standing theory that the Time Lord sent the Second Doctor on missions, sometimes with one or both of his companions, before forcing his regeneration and sending them back to their proper times. That would explain the Second Doctor and Jamie's place on the timeline and their obvious aged appearances in the 6th Doctor serial, The 2 Doctors, where they help the future incarnation of the Doctor deal with a Sontaran issue. In the end, though, it's sort of a sad ending to the Second Doctor. Jamie was likely to never leave the Doctor, and Zoe seemed to feel like she belonged somewhere. But the Time Lords ripped that apart to scold the Doctor for interfering, even though he would ultimately have saved billions, if not trillions, of lives doing the things that he does. As for the Cybermen, well, up to 1969, the Cybermen appeared in 5 serials totaling 26 individual episodes. After 1969, they would still appear in 5 more stories of the classic era, but only for a grand total of 14 individual episodes. The next time the Doctor dealt with the Cybermen would be during the first season featuring Tom Baker's 4th Doctor in Revenge of the Cybermen in 1975. In that serial, the Cybermen were in a weakened state. So they're almost desperate and not their typical threat level. Why they didn't appear in the Third Doctor's era, I don't actually know definitively. There might have been an exposure issue. There could have been a budget issue. It could have just been a decision to go with different villains. However, the Daleks do return for the Third Doctor's era with, I think, 3 serials in all of their own. But either way, the rest of the classic era would steer further away from the Cybermen totally. Now, in the current rebooted era of New Who, they've brought the Cybermen back with a freaking vengeance. Much like with the Master and the Daleks, New Who has gone nutty with legacy villains. Whatever the case is, we've come to the close of the golden age of the Cybermen with the invasion, and if I'm going to be honest with you, I probably won't feature them again on Monster Mondays for quite a bit of time. So we're going to let them rest for a little bit, just like Doctor Who did back in the 70s. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. We leave the classic era of Doctor Who and move on to the modern era of horror. Join me next time as I discuss the 2012 Scott Derrickson Supernatural Spookfest Sinister. Until next week, stay spooky.